She stood in the courtroom, her small hands trembling but her voice unwavering. "Can you explain why your network was used for the transfers?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Parker, who shifted uncomfortably. What happened next changed everything. But let's start at the beginning. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence that followed. Papers shuffled, whispers floated from the back, but all eyes were on the young girl sitting stiffly beside her mother's defense attorney. Haley Walker, just 11 years old, felt the weight of the proceedings pressing down on her small frame, yet she refused to look away. Her mother, Lily, sat at the defendant's table, her shoulders tense, her expression carefully blank. It was a picture of composure that only Haley, her daughter, could see was cracking underneath. Across the room, the prosecutor paced with confidence, his voice sharp and precise as he laid out his case. The details spilled into the room like a storm, financial transfers traced to Lily's account, falsified records bearing her signature, and a damning testimony from Mr. Parker, the director of the charitable foundation. "The evidence," the prosecutor declared, pausing for effect, "is irrefutable." Haley clenched her fists under the table, nails digging into her palms. She had never felt so powerless, so small. She wasn't just watching her mother's life unravel. She was watching the entire world she trusted crumble around her. Lily had always been her hero, a woman who worked tirelessly and lived with unshakable honesty. To see her accused of such a betrayal felt like an insult to everything Haley knew to be true. Judge Raymond, a man whose presence alone seemed to demand order, leaned forward slightly. His piercing eyes scanned the defense table. "Mr. Grayson," he began, his voice low and authoritative, "the prosecution's case is substantial. Your client will need more than denials to rebut this evidence." Thomas Grayson, Lily's defense attorney, stood, his expression calm but strained. "Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that this so-called evidence has significant flaws, and that my client is a victim of circumstance, not a perpetrator." The judge's stern gaze didn't waver. "You may proceed, but the court will not tolerate baseless conjecture. Stick to the facts." As Grayson returned to his seat, Haley whispered, barely audible, "Why aren't you fighting harder? Why aren't you stopping them?" Her voice cracked with desperation. Grayson glanced at her, sympathy softening his features. "I am fighting, Haley, but courtrooms run on proof, not feelings. I need time to uncover the truth." Time. Haley knew her mother didn't have much of it. She glanced toward Mr. Parker, who sat at the edge of the courtroom, his expression unreadable. He had been her mother's boss, someone she had once spoken of with respect. Now, Haley saw only coldness in his demeanor, a smugness that set her teeth on edge. How could he sit there so calmly, condemning someone who had dedicated herself to the foundation? The prosecutor shifted gears, pulling out documents and displaying them to the court. "Here we have the financial records, Your Honor, with transactions leading directly to the defendant's account. These were signed off by Ms. Walker herself." He held the papers aloft, his voice cutting through the room. "The amounts transferred match the discrepancies found in the foundation's budget, totaling nearly $500,000. Gasps rippled through the small audience. Haley could feel her mother's shame like a physical weight, but she refused to look away. She couldn't afford to. "And finally," the prosecutor continued, gesturing toward Parker, "we have the testimony of the foundation's director, Mr. Parker, who personally oversaw the accounts and can confirm Ms. Walker's role in this egregious crime." Parker stood as the prosecutor called his name. He adjusted his tie, a gesture that might have seemed nervous if not for the composed way he spoke. "I trusted Ms. Walker," he began, his voice measured. "She handled the foundation's finances for years, and I never suspected anything, until I discovered these irregularities." Haley's stomach churned, Every word felt like a dagger aimed at her mother, and yet Parker delivered them so smoothly, so confidently. She wanted to scream that he was lying, that none of this could be true. But what proof did she have? She was just a kid sitting in the corner of a courtroom where truth seemed to be drowning under mountains of paperwork and legal jargon. The judge nodded toward the defense. "Your witness, Mr. Grayson." Grayson rose, methodical and deliberate. "Mr. Parker," he began, "you've stated that you trusted my client for years. Isn't it odd that, despite this trust, you were able to immediately identify her as the sole perpetrator of this crime?" Parker didn't flinch. "The evidence led directly to her. I couldn't ignore it." Grayson stepped closer, his tone even. "And did you personally witness Ms. Walker conducting these fraudulent transfers?" "No," Parker admitted, "but the system logs and signatures speak for themselves." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "And those system logs? Who else had access to the accounts?" Parker hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Haley to notice. "Only a select few," he replied, "but all signs point to Ms. Walker." Haley's mind raced. She had seen that hesitation, fleeting as it was. There was something Parker wasn't saying, and it only made her anger burn hotter. How could someone accuse her mother so confidently while hiding the full truth? As the questioning continued, Haley's resolve hardened. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to help her mother. She wouldn't let Parker or anyone else get away with this. Her heart burned with a single thought. The truth might be buried, but it wasn't unreachable. The second day of the trial began with a heavy tension that seemed to settle over the courtroom like an unwelcome fog. Haley Walker sat quietly in her seat, her hands clenched tightly on her lap as the proceedings continued. Her mother, Lily, sat just a few feet away at the defense table, her composure as calm as ever, though Haley knew every word being said cut deeply. The prosecutor, brimming with confidence, was relentless, hammering away at the case against Lily. His voice echoed through the room as he presented yet another series of documents, a damning paper trail that seemed to further cement her guilt. Haley's frustration grew with every word, every accusing glance cast toward her mother. Her mother was innocent. She knew it with absolute certainty. But watching the courtroom unfold, it felt as though her mother's truth was being swallowed whole by the system. Then, as if a switch flipped in her mind, Haley made a decision. Her hand shot up, her voice louder than she expected. "Your Honor, may I testify?" The room froze. Heads turned toward the small girl who had just interrupted the flow of the trial. Even the judge, who had shown little emotion thus far, raised an eyebrow in mild surprise. For a moment no one spoke, the silence thick with disbelief. Judge Raymond regarded Haley with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Miss Walker," he said, his tone steady and authoritative, "this is highly unusual. What exactly do you wish to say?" Haley swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood as tall as her small frame would allow. "I have something important to tell the court," she said firmly. "It's about the night my mom supposedly did what you're accusing her of." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment it seemed he might deny her request. But something in her resolve must have caught his attention. With a brief nod, he motioned for her to approach the stand. "Very well," he said, "but be brief. And remember, young lady, you are under oath." Haley walked to the witness stand, her legs trembling beneath her. She climbed onto the seat and faced the room, her small figure dwarfed by the imposing surroundings. She glanced at her mother, who looked back with a mix of concern and quiet pride. Then, turning her gaze toward the judge, Haley took a deep breath and began to speak. "That night," she started, her voice wavering slightly before steadying. "The night they say my mom stole money from the foundation. We were at home. She couldn't have been at work because we were working on my school project together." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, The judge tapped his gavel lightly to restore order, and the prosecutor immediately rose to his feet, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Walker," he said, addressing Haley directly, "I understand you want to help your mother, but an alibi is only valid if it's supported by evidence. Do you have any proof of this so-called school project? Documents? Witnesses?" Haley hesitated, her confidence wavering under the prosecutor's sharp gaze. "No," she admitted quietly. "But it's true. I remember. We were at the kitchen table all evening, cutting and gluing things for my poster." The prosecutor pounced on her hesitation. "Memories are unreliable, especially those of an 11-year-old. Without evidence, your testimony holds no weight." Haley felt her cheeks flush with frustration and embarrassment. She had spoken the truth, but it felt like no one in the room believed her. She glanced toward her mother, whose expression remained calm, though her eyes betrayed a deep sadness. Haley's gaze dropped to her lap, her earlier courage dissolving into a gnawing sense of helplessness. "Thank you, Miss Walker," the judge said after a brief pause, his tone neutral. "You may step down." Haley climbed down from the stand, her head low as she returned to her seat beside Grayson. She felt like she had failed, not just herself, but her mother. The prosecutor's words echoed in her mind. "Your testimony holds no weight." Grayson leaned toward her, his voice low but firm. "That was brave, Haley. Don't let him make you think otherwise." "But it didn't help," Haley whispered back, her voice thick with unshed tears. "They don't believe me." "It's not about belief," Grayson said. "It's about planting seeds of doubt. You've done that, even if they don't realize it yet." Haley looked up at him, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Grayson straightened in his chair, his gaze fixed on the prosecutor, who was now preening over his latest perceived victory. "The prosecutor brushed you off because he doesn't think you're a threat," he explained. "But your testimony introduced a question he can't fully answer. And questions, Haley, are where we find the truth." Haley thought about his words, a small ember of hope flickering in her chest. She replayed the moment in her mind. The way Parker's expression had subtly changed when she mentioned the school project. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Haley had caught it, a flicker of discomfort, as though her words had struck a nerve. Sitting quietly beside Grayson, Haley began to piece things together in her mind. The school project may not have been enough to sway the courtroom, but it was the truth. And if there was one thing Haley was certain of, it was that the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it was buried. Her courage to speak up, even in the face of dismissal, wasn't wasted. It was the first crack in the wall of lies surrounding her mother's case. Now she just had to find a way to widen it. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the prosecution called their next witness, a technical expert prepared to solidify their case against Lily Walker. The expert, a composed man in his 40s with a neatly pressed suit, adjusted his glasses and began explaining the forensic details of the alleged fraud. His testimony was methodical, his tone clinical, as he outlined how the financial transfers were traced directly to Lily's work computer. Every word felt like another weight dropped onto the defense's shoulders. Haley Walker sat rigid in her chair, her small hands gripping the edge of the table as she hung on to every syllable. Her mind raced with questions, each one adding to her growing frustration. How could these so-called experts speak with such certainty when she knew her mother was innocent? The expert's voice was cold, matter-of-fact, as though her mother's life was nothing more than a line item in a spreadsheet. The prosecutor approached the stand, his confidence radiating through the room. "So, to confirm," he began, his tone measured yet triumphant. "The transactions in question were executed from the defendant's work computer, correct?" "Yes," the expert replied, nodding. "The logs show a clear trail. The transactions were made using credentials tied to Ms. Walker's account, and the timestamps align with her recorded login sessions. Haley's heart sank. The prosecutor turned to the judge, gesturing toward the expert. Your Honor, the evidence is unequivocal. These transactions could not have been executed by anyone other than the defendant. At that moment, Haley's gaze snapped to the screen where the expert had displayed the timestamps. Something caught her attention, a small detail that seemed off, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She stared at the numbers, her mind replaying the night in question. Her mother couldn't have been at the office during those times. Haley was certain of it. They had been at home together, working on her project. She leaned toward Thomas Grayson and tugged on his sleeve. Look at the times, she whispered, her voice urgent. They don't make sense. Grayson glanced at her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Haley pointed toward the screen. Those times. They're too late. Mom was home with me by then. I know she was. Grayson's eyes narrowed as he studied the evidence more closely. He scribbled a note on his legal pad, his demeanor shifting from measured calm to quiet intensity. As the prosecutor wrapped up his questioning, Grayson rose to his feet. Your Honor, he began, addressing the court. The defense would like to cross-examine the witness regarding the timestamps of these transactions. The judge gestured for him to proceed. Grayson approached the technical expert, his tone calm but probing. You testified that the transactions were made during Ms. Walker's recorded login sessions. Can you confirm that these sessions occurred exclusively from her work computer? Yes, the expert replied. The logs indicate that the activity originated from her workstation. Grayson nodded, pacing slightly as he formulated his next question. And are these timestamps absolute indicators of her physical presence at the office, or is it possible that someone else could have accessed her account remotely? The expert hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. It's theoretically possible, he admitted, but there's no direct evidence to suggest that happened in this case. Grayson pressed on. Theoretically possible. Let's explore that. Would someone with the appropriate credentials be able to remotely log in to Ms. Walker's account and execute these transactions without physically being at her computer? The expert shifted in his seat. Yes, that is a possibility, but... Thank you. Grayson interrupted smoothly. Now, regarding the timestamps, could discrepancies arise if someone manipulated or tampered with the system logs? The prosecutor immediately objected, but the judge overruled him, motioning for the expert to answer. The expert's confidence wavered slightly. It's not common, but yes, tampering could create discrepancies. Grayson turned to the judge. Your Honor, given the testimony provided, the defense requests permission to conduct a more thorough investigation into the possibility of remote access or system tampering. The prosecutor scoffed, rising to his feet. Your Honor, this is a baseless fishing expedition. The evidence clearly implicates the defendant. The judge raised a hand to silence him. Mr. Grayson's request is reasonable given the new questions raised. Permission granted. The court will allow additional time for the defense to investigate. For the first time in days, Haley felt a glimmer of hope. She watched as Grayson returned to his seat, his expression calm but determined. He leaned toward her and whispered, "Good catch, Haley. You might have just cracked this case wide open." But not everyone in the room shared their optimism. Haley's eyes darted toward Mr. Parker, who sat stiffly in his chair, his once relaxed posture now taut with tension. His hand fidgeted with his tie, his gaze fixed on the floor. For the first time since the trial began, he looked uncomfortable, almost as though he was trying to avoid the growing scrutiny. Haley's instincts told her she was onto something. Parker's demeanor was shifting, his confidence eroding as the defense poked holes in the narrative he had so confidently constructed. She didn't know exactly what he was hiding, but she was certain now that he wasn't telling the whole truth. The session adjourned shortly after, the courtroom emptying as people filed out. But Haley remained seated for a moment longer, her mind racing. The discrepancies in the logs, Parker's unease, it all added up to something bigger. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was buried. But for the first time, she felt like they had a shovel. They just needed to keep digging. As she stood to leave, Haley's resolve hardened. She wasn't just watching the trial anymore. She was part of it. And she wasn't going to let her mother's story end with a lie. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as Haley Walker's small voice broke through the silence. "Your Honor," she began, standing from her seat beside her mother's defense attorney. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice carried a steadiness beyond her 11 years. "May I ask the witness a question?" The room collectively froze. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. The judge, momentarily stunned, leaned forward and regarded her with a curious yet skeptical expression. "Miss Walker," he said slowly, "do you understand the gravity of what you're asking? This is highly irregular." Haley nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I understand, Your Honor, but I think my question is important." There was no defiance in her tone, only quiet determination. The judge studied her for a moment longer, his stern demeanor softening ever so slightly before he nodded. "Very well. Proceed." The prosecutor's smirk faltered as Haley approached the witness stand. The technical expert, a man with an air of authority, looked at her with mild confusion, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned by a child. Haley climbed onto the small stool provided for her, barely tall enough to meet his gaze. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "Sir?" Haley began, her voice clear and direct. "Is it possible that someone else could have used my mom's account to make those transactions?" The expert blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. "Well," he began cautiously, "it is technically possible, but it would require knowledge of her credentials and access to the system." Haley tilted her head slightly, her curiosity genuine. "So, if someone knew her password or had access to her computer, they could have done it without her knowing?" The expert hesitated, the faintest flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Yes," he admitted, "but it's highly unlikely without additional evidence to support that theory." Before Haley could respond, the prosecutor shot to his feet, his voice sharp and condescending. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The defense is allowing a child to grasp at baseless hypotheticals in a desperate attempt to derail the case." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "Sit down, counselor. The witness is responding to the question, which, I remind you, is within the bounds of this court." His gaze shifted back to Haley. "Continue, Miss Walker." Haley's heart pounded in her chest, but she pressed on. "But you just said it's possible. Even if it's unlikely, isn't it worth looking into? If my mom didn't do it, then someone else must have, right?" The expert opened his mouth to respond, but the murmurs from the audience grew louder. The quiet, composed courtroom was now buzzing with speculation. People leaned toward each other, whispering in hushed voices as Haley's simple question planted doubt. Haley glanced toward her mother, who sat watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. For a moment, Haley felt her resolve waver. What if the prosecutor was right? What if no one took her seriously because of her age? She was just a kid, after all. What difference could she make? Sensing her hesitation, Thomas Grayson rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "Miss Walker has raised a valid point. The prosecution has relied heavily on the assumption that these transactions were carried out directly by the defendant. However, the expert witness has now admitted that alternative scenarios, while unlikely, are possible." The prosecutor scoffed loudly, but Grayson ignored him, his focus on the judge. "Given this new admission, the defense formally requests a deeper examination of the access logs and any other digital records that could clarify whether there was unauthorized access to Ms. Walker's account." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone awaited his decision. Finally, he nodded. "The court grants the defense's request. I expect the investigation to be conducted promptly." The courtroom erupted into murmurs once more, and this time Haley could see the cracks forming in the prosecution's case. Across the room, Mr. Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident demeanor beginning to waver. Haley's question, so simple yet so direct, had unearthed a vulnerability in their narrative that couldn't be ignored. The prosecutor, visibly irritated, turned to address the judge. "Your Honor, this is a waste of the court's time. The evidence we've presented is clear and overwhelming. This attempt to redirect the focus of the trial is nothing more than a baseless distraction." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Enough, counselor. The court has made its decision." His gaze shifted toward Haley, his expression softening just slightly. "Miss Walker, you may step down." Haley climbed down from the stool, her knees trembling as she returned to her seat beside Grayson. The weight of the moment hit her all at once. She had spoken up. She had made a difference. And for the first time since the trial began, she felt like the truth might finally come to light. Grayson leaned toward her, his voice low and reassuring. "You did good, Haley. Really good." Haley looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Do you think it'll matter, what I said?" "It already does," Grayson replied. His gaze shifted toward the prosecutor and Parker, who were now locked in a hushed, tense conversation. "You made them nervous. That's how we start to win." Haley sat back in her chair, her heart still pounding but her confidence slowly returning. The prosecutor could dismiss her all he wanted, but she had seen the truth in the expert's hesitation and the way Parker avoided her gaze. The truth was there just beneath the surface. Now they just had to dig it out. The tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point as Thomas Grayson, Lily Walker's defense attorney, stood with a palpable energy of determination. In his hands, he held a fresh piece of evidence, a document that had the potential to dismantle the prosecution's case. The room, already hanging on every word, seemed to hold its collective breath as Grayson addressed the court. "Your Honor," Grayson began, his voice steady but carrying a sharp edge, "the defense has obtained new evidence that calls into question the prosecution's entire narrative. This evidence not only challenges their claims but implicates another party entirely." The judge raised an eyebrow, signaling Grayson to proceed. Walking to the projector at the front of the courtroom, Grayson displayed a digital log on the screen. Rows of data filled the image, each line representing a recorded login session. The highlighted entry caught everyone's attention. "These," Grayson said, pointing to the screen, "are the access logs for the transactions in question. As you can see, the IP address associated with these sessions doesn't match the office network. In fact, they originate from a private network tied directly to Mr. Parker's residence." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Haley, sitting beside her mother, leaned forward, her heart pounding as she watched Parker shift uncomfortably in his seat. His once confident demeanor now betrayed flickers of unease. He fidgeted with his tie, avoiding the eyes of the judge and jury. Grayson continued, turning to face Parker directly. "Mr. Parker," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "can you explain why these transactions were executed from a network linked to your home?" Parker's jaw tightened. I have no idea what you're talking about," he stammered, his composure starting to crack. "This must be some kind of mistake." Grayson didn't flinch. "A mistake? The records are clear, Mr. Parker. The transactions occurred at times when Ms. Walker was not in the office, and the system logs point directly to your network. So, I'll ask again. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Parker's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The jury's eyes were fixed on him, their expressions shifting from skepticism to suspicion. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. It was at this moment that Haley, who had been silently observing every detail, had a sudden flash of memory. Her mind raced back to a foundation meeting she had attended with her mother months ago. She vividly remembered Parker holding her mother's laptop, typing on it while talking to another colleague. Her heart thumped in her chest as the realization hit her. He had access to her mother's device long before any of this had happened. Without thinking, Haley stood up, her voice ringing out in the tense courtroom. "I remember," she exclaimed, drawing every eye in the room to her. The judge, startled by the outburst, rapped his gavel sharply. "Order! Miss Walker, what are you talking about?" Haley swallowed hard, but her resolve didn't waver. "I saw him," she said, pointing at Parker. "I saw Mr. Parker using my mom's laptop during a meeting at the foundation. He had it for a long time. He could have done anything with it." The courtroom exploded into murmurs, the sudden revelation sending shockwaves through everyone present. The judge called for silence again, but even he looked intrigued. "Mr. Grayson," the judge said, "is there any evidence to corroborate this claim?" Grayson turned to Haley, his eyes filled with newfound determination. "Miss Walker, are you absolutely certain of what you saw?" Haley nodded firmly. "Yes, I was there. He had her laptop." Grayson wasted no time. "Your Honor, this revelation adds another critical layer to the defense's argument. If Mr. Parker had access to Ms. Walker's laptop, it would explain how the transactions were executed using her credentials." Parker, now visibly cornered, raised his hands in protest. "This is absurd," he shouted. "I was just borrowing her laptop for work. It's not unusual for colleagues to share devices." "But unusual," Grayson interjected, his voice sharp. "To use that device to execute fraudulent transactions from your personal network, is it not?" The prosecutor attempted to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. All eyes were now locked on Parker, who was quickly running out of room to maneuver. His confident facade had completely crumbled, replaced by a look of sheer panic. His voice cracked as he tried to defend himself. "You can't seriously believe I—" Grayson stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. "Believe what, Mr. Parker? That you, the director of the foundation, had access to the laptop, access to the credentials, and a private network where these transactions originated? The evidence speaks for itself." The room fell silent, the weight of Grayson's words pressing down on everyone. Parker looked to the prosecutor for support, but the man sat stone-faced, unwilling to intervene. The judge's gaze bore into Parker, unrelenting. Finally, under the weight of the evidence and the pressure of the courtroom, Parker's shoulders slumped. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Fine," he said, his words heavy with defeat. "I did it." The confession hung in the air, followed by a collective gasp from the audience. Parker continued, his voice trembling. "I needed the money. The foundation was struggling, and I thought no one would suspect her. She's just an accountant." Haley's heart raced as she watched the man who had tried to destroy her mother's life crumble before her eyes. The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court!" Parker's admission marked a turning point, a moment that shifted the trajectory of the trial entirely. Haley glanced at her mother, who sat frozen in shock, but with a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. Grayson returned to his seat, a quiet satisfaction in his demeanor. He leaned toward Haley and whispered, "You just helped save your mom." Haley felt a surge of relief, but the fight wasn't over yet. There was still more to uncover, more justice to be served. But for the first time, she felt the tides turning in their favor. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Gasps, murmurs, and even the sharp scrape of chairs echoed through the chamber as Parker's trembling confession settled into the stunned silence that followed. The director, once so composed and self-assured, now sat crumbling under the weight of his guilt. His head hung low, and his shoulders sagged as the enormity of his actions caught up with him. Reporters in the back scrambled to jot down notes, their pens flying across pages, while the audience exchanged shocked whispers. Judge Raymond, however, wasted no time regaining control. His gavel came down with a sharp crack, silencing the noise in an instant. "Order!" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The room fell into an uneasy hush as everyone turned their attention to the bench. The judge's stern face betrayed a flicker of anger as he glared at Parker. "Mr. Parker," he began, his tone cold and deliberate, "your actions not only jeopardized the integrity of the foundation you were entrusted to lead, but also sought to destroy an innocent woman's life. Your selfishness and deceit are reprehensible." Parker remained motionless, his hands gripping the edges of the table as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. The judge turned his attention to Lily, whose wide eyes reflected a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Ms. Walker," Judge Raymond continued, "this court finds no evidence to support the charges brought against you. All accusations are hereby dismissed." The gavel came down once more, and for the first time in weeks, Lily exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The weight that had pressed so heavily on her chest finally lifted. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of relief, of vindication. But the judge wasn't finished. His gaze shifted toward Haley, who sat beside her mother, still stunned by the rapid turn of events. "Miss Walker," he said, his voice softening for the first time that day, "please approach the bench." Haley hesitated, glancing toward her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, she stood and made her way to the front of the room. The courtroom was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the young girl whose courage had turned the tide of the trial. Judge Raymond leaned forward, his imposing presence tempered by a rare smile. "Miss Walker," he said, "this court owes you a debt of gratitude. Your bravery, quick thinking, and unwavering belief in the truth have not only saved your mother, but exposed a grave injustice. It's not every day that we see someone of your age display such remarkable integrity." Haley felt her cheeks flush, her hands fidgeting nervously at her sides. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but there was a warmth in the judge's words that made her stand a little taller. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. The judge nodded, his smile lingering for just a moment before his expression turned serious again. "And as for Mr. Parker," he said, his voice booming across the room, "your actions will not go unpunished. Bailiffs, take him into custody." The two bailiffs moved swiftly, placing Parker in handcuffs as he offered no resistance. The sight of the once powerful man being led away sent another ripple of murmurs through the audience. But Haley didn't watch him leave. Her focus was on her mother, who was now rising from her seat, tears streaming down her face. As Haley returned to her seat, Lily opened her arms and Haley rushed into them. The embrace was tight, filled with a mixture of relief, love, and the overwhelming emotions of a battle finally won. "You did it," Lily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." "No, Mom," Haley replied, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. "We did it. Together." Around them, the courtroom began to empty as people filtered out, but neither of them noticed. For that moment, it felt like the rest of the world had melted away, leaving just the two of them, free at last from the shadow of injustice that had loomed over their lives for so long. Thomas Grayson approached them, his usual professional demeanor replaced by a rare grin. "Well, I think it's safe to say you two are quite the team," he said warmly. "Haley, I don't think I've ever had a client's daughter do my job better than me." Haley managed a small laugh, wiping her eyes. "I just wanted everyone to know the truth." Grayson nodded, And you made sure they did. Don't underestimate how big of a deal that is. Lily turned to Grayson, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Grayson, for believing in us, for fighting for us. He shook his head. Don't thank me. Your daughter is the real hero here. As the three of them stood together, the gravity of the moment began to settle in. The nightmare was over. Lily was free, and Haley had proven that even the smallest voice could make a difference. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, reporters swarmed them, microphones thrust forward and cameras flashing. Questions flew in rapid succession. Haley, how did you stay so brave? Lily, how does it feel to be exonerated? What's next for your family? Haley took a deep breath, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. I just believed in the truth, she said simply, and I believed in my mom. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers following the walkers as they made their way down the courthouse steps. For the first time in weeks, the future felt bright. The truth had won, and the shadows of doubt and despair had been replaced by the warmth of hope and justice. As they walked away from the courthouse, Lily placed an arm around Haley's shoulders. No matter what happens next, she said, her voice steady and full of love, we'll face it together. Haley smiled up at her mother. Together, they were unstoppable. The courthouse steps were alive with chaos. Reporters with microphones, cameras, and notepads swarmed the area, jostling for position to capture the moment. The walkers had barely stepped outside when the questions started flying, voices overlapping in an unintelligible cacophony. Haley gripped her mother's hand tightly, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her as the crowd pressed closer. Haley, how did you stay so brave? One reporter shouted over the noise. Lily, how does it feel to be exonerated? Asked another, leaning forward with a microphone. What will you do now? Haley, what do you want others to take from your story? Haley blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the intensity of the scene. Her mother knelt beside her, squeezing her hand gently. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, Lily said softly, her voice filled with concern. But Haley shook her head, drawing in a deep breath. She looked up at the sea of faces, their eyes wide with expectation. This was her moment, not just for herself and her mother, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced or powerless. She stepped forward, just far enough for her voice to carry, her small frame radiating a quiet confidence that instantly silenced the crowd. Sometimes, Haley began, her voice clear and steady despite the weight of so many eyes on her, the truth needs someone brave enough to fight for it. The reporters froze, their pens poised midair, their microphones capturing every word. Haley's simple statement seemed to cut through the noise, resonating far beyond the courthouse steps. The weight of her words hung in the air for a moment before the crowd erupted in applause, cheers, and a renewed wave of questions. Haley, what would you say to other kids in your position? Do you think your story will inspire change? What's the next step for you and your family? Grayson, who had been standing to the side with a watchful eye, stepped forward and gently gestured for the reporters to back up. That's all for now, he said firmly but kindly. The walkers have been through enough. Let's give them the space they deserve. As the reporters reluctantly began to disperse, Haley turned to her mother. Was that okay? She asked, her voice small again, as if the courage she had summoned had already begun to fade. Lily's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming pride. She knelt down and pulled Haley into a hug. It was more than okay, Haley. It was perfect. You're amazing. By the time they got home, Haley's words had already begun spreading. Clips of her short speech appeared on news broadcasts and social media, captioned with phrases like, "A brave young hero," and "The girl who fought for the truth." Comments flooded in from strangers around the world, praising Haley's courage and the strength of her family. I cried listening to this little girl, One post read, "She's a reminder that the truth always matters, no matter how small your voice might seem." Another wrote, "Haley Walker is proof that even the youngest among us can change the world." Haley scrolled through some of the messages on her tablet, her brow furrowed as she read them. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "why do people care so much? I just did what anyone would do." Lily looked up from the couch, her expression thoughtful. "Not everyone would have done what you did, Haley. A lot of people are too scared to speak up, even when they know something isn't right. You showed them that it's possible." Haley considered this for a moment, then looked back at the screen. Among the praise, there were stories. People sharing their own experiences with injustice, times when they had been too afraid to stand up for themselves, or moments when they had wished for someone to fight for them. "I didn't think I'd inspire anyone," Haley admitted quietly. "I just wanted to help you." "And in doing that," Lily said, moving to sit beside her, "you helped so many more people than you realize." The next day, Haley's story dominated the news. Anchors recounted the trial in detail, emphasizing how a young girl's determination had uncovered the truth and exposed the lies of a man who had used his position to harm others. They played her speech on repeat, her words striking a chord with viewers across the country. Organizations dedicated to justice, reform, and advocacy for the falsely accused reached out, offering their thanks and support to the Walker family. One group even sent Haley a letter, inviting her to speak at an event about standing up for the truth. Lily read the letter aloud at the breakfast table, her voice full of emotion. "They're calling you a role model, Haley." Haley blushed, poking at her cereal. "I don't feel like a role model." "Well, you are," Lily said, her voice firm but kind. "You showed everyone that standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's hard." That evening, Lily sat on the porch, watching the sunset as Haley joined her with a notebook in hand. "What are you working on?" Lily asked. Haley held up the notebook, its pages filled with scribbles and sketches. "I'm writing down all the things I remember about the trial," she explained. "I don't want to forget anything." Lily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "You won't forget. Not something like this." Haley nodded, but her expression was serious. "Mom, do you think this will really help people?" Lily placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It already has. And it will keep helping. You gave people hope, Haley. You reminded them that even when things seem impossible, the truth can still win." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to fade. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future felt bright, not just for their family, but for all the people who had been inspired by Haley's courage. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Haley closed her notebook and looked up at her mother. "I'm glad I spoke up," she said softly. Lily smiled, her pride evident in every word. "So am I, Haley. So am I." The courtroom was eerily silent now, the bustling energy of the trial having long since dissipated. The rows of benches, once filled with onlookers, reporters, and supporters, stood empty, their wooden surfaces gleaming faintly under the dimmed overhead lights. Haley Walker sat alone in the middle of the room, her small figure dwarfed by the vastness of the space. She gazed intently at the judge's bench, her thoughts a swirl of emotions that she couldn't quite put into words. The events of the past weeks felt like a distant storm, though echoes of it still lingered in her mind. The gavel strikes, the sharp voices of the attorneys, the heavy accusations that had hung over her mother like a shadow, they all replayed in fragments, each one sharper than the last. And yet, here she was, sitting in a quiet room that had once been the epicenter of their fight for justice. The silence felt heavy but not oppressive. It was a silence that spoke of resolution and, perhaps, a new beginning. Haley ran her fingers along the edge of the bench in front of her, the smooth wood cool under her touch. Her gaze lingered on the judge's chair, the place where so many pivotal decisions had been made. It seemed larger now, more imposing in the emptiness. She thought about the words the judge had said to her, how he had praised her bravery and her commitment to the truth. She had never thought of herself as brave before. She was just Haley, an ordinary girl who loved school projects and afternoons with her mom. But somewhere along the way, she had become more. The faint creak of a door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Haley turned to see her mother entering the room, her steps soft but purposeful. Lily's expression was a mixture of warmth and pride, though the exhaustion of the trial still lingered in her eyes. She approached Haley and stopped just behind her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You okay, sweetheart?" Lily asked, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a mother's concern. Haley nodded, her gaze returning to the judge's bench. "Yeah, I just needed a moment." Lily sat down beside her, the two of them now side by side in the quiet courtroom. For a while, neither of them spoke, the stillness stretching between them like a comforting blanket. Lily didn't press her daughter, sensing that Haley was still processing everything that had happened. Finally, Haley broke the silence. "Do you think people will remember what happened here?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Lily looked at her, studying her daughter's profile. Haley's expression was pensive, her brows furrowed as if she were trying to solve a puzzle far bigger than herself. "I think they'll remember you," Lily said. "What you did here, Haley, it mattered. You showed the world that the truth is worth fighting for." Haley turned to meet her mother's gaze. "But what if it's not enough?" she asked quietly. "What if there's more wrong out there? What if other people are going through the same thing?" Lily smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Haley's face. "Then they'll need someone like you to remind them that they're not alone, that it's okay to stand up, even when it's scary." Haley nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench tightly. The courtroom may have been empty, but she could still feel the weight of all that had transpired within these walls. She had walked into this room as a scared little girl, unsure of what she could do to help her mother. But she was leaving as someone who had stood her ground, faced doubt and dismissal, and come out the other side with the truth on her side. Her eyes flicked back to the judge's bench, and for a moment she imagined herself sitting there, making decisions that could change lives. It wasn't a fleeting thought, nor was it a childish fantasy. It was a possibility, a future she hadn't considered before, but now felt like a seed planted deep in her heart. "There's so much more truth to uncover," Haley said finally, her voice steady and filled with quiet determination. "It's not just about what happened to us. There are other people out there who need someone to believe in them." Lily's chest swelled with pride, though she felt a lump rise in her throat. Her little girl wasn't so little anymore. "You're right," she said. "And if anyone can help them, it's you." They sat there for a few moments longer, the gravity of Haley's words sinking in. Outside, the world was moving on. The reporters had packed up their equipment, the crowd had dispersed, and the courthouse was returning to its usual rhythm. But inside, Haley and Lily remained, sharing a quiet moment that felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. As they stood to leave, Haley took one last look around the room. The memories of everything that had happened here would stay with her, but they no longer felt heavy. Instead, they felt like a part of her, something she could carry forward, something that would guide her. When they stepped outside into the evening air, the courthouse behind them, Haley felt the cool breeze brush against her face. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the street. She reached for her mother's hand, and Lily took it without hesitation. "What do you want to do now?" Lily asked, her tone light but curious. Haley thought for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. I don't know yet, she admitted. But whatever it is, I want it to matter. Lily squeezed her hand, her heart full. It already does, Haley. It already does. And as they walked away from the courthouse, their silhouettes fading into the bustling city around them, it was clear that Haley's journey was far from over. But for now, they walked forward together, leaving behind the echoes of a courtroom that had forever changed their lives.